The Carolingian forces conducted extensive campaigns, besieged enemy strongholds, and frequently achieved victory through numerical and organizational superiority. They subdued diverse groups, including the Saxons, Lombards, Aquitanians, Bretons, Avars, Bavarians, Slavs, Frisians, and Northmen. Many of these conquered peoples were later integrated into the Frankish army, known as the exercitus, and became part of its political framework. At its zenith under Charlemagne in the early 9th century, the Carolingian Empire was a formidable rival to the Byzantine and Abbasid empires. Our understanding of their military structure derives from annals, capitularies, and the correspondence of Einhard, Charlemagne's advisor. While the annals chronicle military expeditions, the capitularies offer limited insights into recruitment and organization. Despite these sources, the exact methods by which the Carolingians mobilized their powerful armies remain unclear. This ambiguity has fueled intense academic debate over recent decades. In this video, we will explore the core issues of this debate and illuminate the complexities underpinning the Carolingian military system. First, some foundational points. After the feudal system was discredited as an explanation for the Carolingian army in the 1990s, three primary models for Carolingian army organization emerged. These are the warband model, the conscription model, and the patron-client network model. All three models rely mainly on the same historical sources, but reach differing conclusions due to variations in methodological approaches, distinct interpretations of source function, and different questions posed to the sources. One of the principal and frequently used sources for Carolingian military history comprises the capitularies. These are collections of decrees issued by Carolingian rulers that addressed various aspects of governance throughout the Carolingian Empire. The capitularies cover subjects ranging from ideal royal estates to clerical duties and military organization. Modern scholarship views the capitularies as records of the king's ad hoc consultations with various magnates, aiming to collaboratively and consensually address specific problems within the realm. The capitularies that have survived to our time were produced at different stages of this consultation process, or as directives for royal officials, the missi dominici, who were responsible for implementing these decisions across the vast empire. Consequently, they were likely created less as innovative normative legal texts and more as indicators of a shift in the importance of writing within Frankish governance. The objective was to codify existing practices, optimize them, and devise solutions for particular cases. Complicating matters further, no capitularies have survived in their original form. They only exist as copies from the later 9th century, and especially the 10th century, found in collections alongside various other texts, which significantly hinders their interpretation. The dating and interrelationships of the capitularies are therefore frequently based on scholarly assumptions and are increasingly subject to revision. These developments are critical for understanding the diverse provisions related to the Frankish Carolingian military system. Several capitularies from Charlemagne's era are particularly significant for understanding the Carolingian army, as they are sometimes used to formally trace its structure. Notably, the Memoratorium de Exercitu Gallia Occidentali Preparando of 807 and the Capitulare Missorum de Exercitu Promovendo, with its disputed dating of 808, have been elevated by researchers to the status of key evidence for Frankish Carolingian army organization. These documents indicate, for instance, the fundamental system where every free man, meaning freeman, who has 4 mansos, a unit of land and income, either of his own or as a beneficium, a benefit, from someone else, should equip himself and join the army independently.
But he who has 3 mansos of his own shall be joined to one who has 1 manse, and he shall support the latter so that he can go out for both. Men with fewer possessions were thus grouped so that one could serve on behalf of all. Those who evaded their duty faced the hariban penalty of 60 solidi. Other capitularies stipulated the specific equipment a warrior needed to bring to the army, again scaled according to their wealth. The concept of lantwary, or defensio patriae, implying that everyone in a region had to defend their homeland as a militia, also appears in the capitularies. Thus, much about the Carolingian army seems clear. There was a compulsory military service for specific social groups, penalties for non-compliance, and a method to recruit as many men as possible for both offensive and defensive operations. It was once proposed that the fundamental concept of universal service dated back to ancient times. But why are these regulations concerning the Frankish army system found in the early 9th century? Earlier research from the 19th and early 20th centuries, heavily influenced by so-called German constitutional history and the quest for the origins of the feudal system, postulated that Charlemagne aimed to more equitably distribute the burden of military service through his decrees. It was then assumed that all Franks were obliged to perform military service in a long continuous tradition stretching back to the descriptions of Tacitus. However, as the Carolingian army evolved and increasingly comprised armored horsemen, military service became prohibitively expensive for many freemen. To safeguard this group of freemen and enable their continued participation in military service, the aforementioned armament associations were established. This form of general military service was then gradually superseded by the feudal armies of the High Middle Ages. However, this older interpretation was increasingly abandoned in the second half of the 20th century, along with the notions of an early medieval feudal system and a singular Germanic identity. The anthropologically influenced ideas of the war band offered a fresh perspective on these sources. Initiated by Timothy Rita, this model suggested that after a century of expansion during the 8th century, the Carolingian Empire reached its maximum territorial extent in the early 9th century under Charlemagne, its borders ultimately stretching from the Pyrenees to Thuringia and from Denmark to Benevento.
However, Reuter's argument was not based on logistical requirements, geographical or topographical conditions. Instead, he argued that the empire's elite had lost interest in further expansion. This is where Reuter's warband concept comes into play. According to him, following the teachings of Hans Delbrück, the father of modern military history, Carolingian armies were relatively small but highly elite. At their core, these armies were aristocratic groups of mounted warriors assembled around a magnate who acted as a warlord. These groups of young warriors were bound together by gifts from the warlord to his fighters, oaths, shared festivities, and ultimately, the prospect of a young warrior himself rising to the status of such a warrior aristocrat by acquiring land. As the Frankish Empire expanded, a steady flow of luxury goods and spoils could be channeled into a gift economy, sustaining the warbands. The core idea of the warband as the foundation of the early medieval army was also corroborated by other researchers, such as Jeanette Nelson, and prominent figures like Guy Halsall, and is now considered standard knowledge. However, as the empire's borders expanded, the priorities of the Carolingian aristocracy shifted. The distances the exercitus had to travel to confront enemies grew longer. Military service became more costly, and the spoils of war diminished. From a cost-benefit perspective, military service became less appealing. People increasingly focused on the court, where they could advance their careers and gain power. Concurrently, various groups, Norsemen, Slavs, Muslims, and Avars, threatened the borders of the Regnum Francorum. The hunters became the hunted. The aristocratic warrior groups had little interest in fending off these raiders, and holding lands in threatened areas was also unattractive due to the high defense costs. To defend the empire, appropriate laws were needed that obliged landowners to participate in defensive battles and to generally arm more people.
Military service thus had to be adapted and regulated in line with the empire's new defensive needs. More individuals were to be involved in military service. Later capitularies from Louis the Pious or Charles the Bald, which frequently reference Charlemagne's instructions, would seemingly confirm this development. However, this position is not without dispute. Other researchers point out that booty does not appear as frequently in narrative historiographical sources as Reuter suggests. Major spoils like the pagan Saxon plunder at Eresburg or the Avar treasure were not acquired daily. Luxury goods or treasures were less likely to be common spoils of war than arms and armor or everyday items, livestock, and slaves. Guy Halsall himself now considers intangible spoils, such as fame, peer recognition, and distinction through campaign participation, as more significant elements of the aristocratic self-image. Finally, the criticism is leveled that the concept of a warrior aristocracy underlying the warbands relies more on Tacitus's Germania or epic heroic poems like Beowulf than on Carolingian sources. The idea of a defensive shift and the Carolingian army as one primarily composed of mounted warriors has also been criticized. These conceptions of the Frankish Carolingian army were considered too simplistic and inadequate for the demands of post-Roman warfare. Mounted warbands relying solely on plunder would not have been able to conquer the urbis, civitas, or oppida that dotted the landscape, and yet it is precisely siege warfare that characterizes Carolingian military activity in the annals.
Revisiting the idea of compulsory service, a different perspective on the Carolingian army emerged, that of strong to maximum late antique Roman continuity, notably championed by Bernard S. Bachrach. According to him, the duty of free Franks to serve in the army or defend their homeland was not an ancient Germanic obligation, but an old Roman one. From the 4th and 5th centuries onward, late Roman emperors had increasingly militarized their empire through a strategy of defense in depth. Large segments of the population were obliged to perform military service, paid their taxes as labor services, or supplied soldiers from the grain harvested from their cultivated land. Similar duties had been established among the Germanic foederati who settled on Roman soil and inherited the empire's legacy and structures in the West after Rome's decline. As a result, a Frankish military apparatus evolved during the early Middle Ages, presenting itself as a triad. Every man was obligated to defend the Carolingian lands as part of his service duty. These men constituted the general levy, who could fulfill their duty by working on defensive structures or infrastructure projects, among other things. Nevertheless, these men were trained and armed to defend their urbis and civitates. The men of the expeditionary levies were recruited from the larger pool of men obligated to military service, based on property criteria. This is where the aforementioned capitularies become relevant. These served as a regulatory mechanism that began under the Merovingians and was only formalized and standardized in writing under Charlemagne. Men participating in expeditions against the Franks' enemies were selected according to land ownership criteria. The expeditionary levy formed the bulk of the manpower needed for campaigns and sieges, as conquering fortified locations was a central aspect of warfare. To the west of the Rhine lay Roman structures, and to the east and southeast were Saxon, Slavic, or Avar fortifications to be conquered. And finally, the king's magnates, the counts, abbots, and bishops of the Frankish Empire, and the king himself, provided troops. These men were members of the magnates' households and received direct payment from them or were granted land and income. Thus provided with an income, they formed the elite core of the Carolingian army as professional, regular, drilled soldiers. Depending on tactical needs, they fought mounted or dismounted, but were consistently highly efficient. According to this tripartite system, researchers like Peterson, a student of Bachrach, estimate troop numbers approaching 145,000 men. During campaigns, these massive troop contingents were supplied from royal estates situated along the most crucial deployment routes, where significant provisions were stored. While abroad, warriors were expected to carry 3 months' worth of supplies and equipment. The continuity of ancient military knowledge is also a decisive factor in this depiction of Carolingian military organization. The training of military leaders and soldiers followed late antique military treatises such as Vegetius's Epitoma de Re Militari, whose recommendations were implemented in training soldiers or constructing military structures. However, this maximalist view of a late antique military tradition and organization for the Carolingian army itself presents several issues. Firstly, there is the concept of universal military duty. The aforementioned capitularies simply do not explicitly support this idea. As Walter Goffart pointed out, the capitularies quite precisely state that only free men were bound to military duty and to serve in the exercitus. He also questioned the notion of Landwehr or Defensio Patriae as a regional militia. Here, it is more probable that these terms were used in the context of methods to quickly muster the regular army when the realm was under attack. Nevertheless, those who mustered were regular members of the exercitus, while the labor on defensive structures carried out by lower-income freemen also constituted a duty that made them part of the regular exercitus. He also repeatedly argued against the idea of a select corps of household troops, as there is no mention of them in the sources in the systematically depicted manner, and as Christoph Hock highlighted, we know virtually nothing about the households of Carolingian magnates. Hock instead points to the idea of patron-client networks, focusing on the relationship between the liberi homines and the ruler on a more localized basis. He emphasizes that the liberi homines were indeed a distinct social group within the Carolingian realm. While they shared the common status of being above the unfree coloni, servi, or villani, the group of freemen itself was quite heterogeneous. Some were wealthy inhabitants of large estates, while others were poorer, even to the point of owning no land at all. Many placed themselves under the protection or in the support of wealthier freemen. Thus they became clients, while still retaining their status as free franks or homines. The wealthier freemen, who could be prominent magnates like an abbot or a count, became their signores, meaning their leaders or lords, but without the older connotation of a liege lord.
Crucially, what all free Franks still shared, regardless of possessions or rank, and what defined their status as freemen, were their duties to the king, who regarded all freemen as his fideles, his trusted ones, his subjects. Fulfilling these military duties, as well as other services, became the fundamental and often only interaction lower freemen had with the concept of a realm and belonging to something politically larger. Thus, the patrons, or signores, acted as the social interface through which the ruling king's power was transmitted into the local, regional sphere, where a magnate himself was the core of power, just as the king was for the overall realm. When the Carolingian king sought to raise his host, he would call upon his various magnates. These magnates, being the patrons of other free Franks, would then call upon their clients for their services. These clients would follow the call for a myriad of reasons, shaped by different local customs, be it land grants, family ties, administrative services, a job offered on an estate, or even the magnate paying for their children's education. All these liberi homines would flock to their signores to fulfill their duty in the way they were capable and asked, whether as humble cart handlers, simple spearmen, ironclad aristocratic warriors, or siege engineers. Assemblies like the Marsfeld were traditional starting points for some expeditions, though not consistently used. From there, the host traditionally commenced their expedition, most likely supplied by royal estates and fodder they brought themselves. This recent model, only broadly outlined here, can therefore be understood as a middle ground between the idea of compulsory service and strong royal authority, while also emphasizing its local implementation and the social bonds between individuals. We have observed throughout this video that comprehending the fundamentals of the Carolingian army is challenging. The contemporary sources, often perceived as unambiguous, are subject to evolving interpretations and scholarly concepts. The dating of sources is frequently uncertain and sometimes represents research interpretations that are themselves refutable, as are the conceptual frameworks historians apply to these sources. However, a closer examination of the Carolingian Empire's elusive local level coupled with a sharper understanding of the Free Franks and the characteristics of their official duties, promises further intriguing insights into the armies of the Carolingians. We will continue discussing the history of the Franks in the coming months, so please ensure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to stay updated. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can access over 200+ exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule,